And I'll highlight myself. Okay, welcome everyone. We are so glad to have Professor Ben Zeller back with us. He was here the week. I give him the hardest weeks of the year because he had the week after the election, and I said, hey, can you take the week after the inauguration? And he was really, thank goodness he took this week, and we have a lot to talk about and a lot to ask him. He's the Associate Professor of Religion and Chair of Religion and Chair of the Islamic World Studies at Lake Forest College. And he is a member of Macomb Soleil Lakeside. His areas of specialization are religion in America, religion and culture, religion and science, and new religious movements. So I don't know.
Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
There we go. I don't know what he has in store for us today, but I can't wait to hear. And with no further, Ben, please take it away.
Okay, thank you. So you said you didn't know what you had in store. I didn't really either until the inauguration. I wanted to think about it and try to think about it. And really, honestly, though, I also want to talk about the January 6th Capitol assault as well, because I think that we can't talk about the inauguration without talking about the process which led up to it. So for those of you who came to my previous talk, as you'll probably remember, and thank you, Vanessa, for the lovely introduction, my training is in religious studies. So I tend to look at everything through a lens of religion. I don't think that's inappropriate for looking at American politics. I think they've been linked and have been linked really always, but especially really in the last 40 years, 50 years after the rise of the Christian right. But so that is the lens I'm taking, and I should note that if for a person with no interest in the connection between religion and politics, they may take a very, very different look. But I'll tell you what jumped out with me. So my thought is that I would talk a bit about the January 6th Capitol assault, and then talk a bit about the inauguration itself, and then really leave plenty of time for conversation and questions. And we can talk amongst yourselves, and I can certainly give you my opinion, but I'm not a political scientist. So in terms of projecting what goes forward, I have no more ability than anyone else in the room, less than many of you. But all right, to start. So as I was thinking, and like I think all of you, I think I just sat January 6th and just watched the news. I think I clicked refresh on my computer every 15 seconds at times, trying to see if I had New York Times open and Washington Post and CNN, trying to figure out what was going on. I think it was a momentous occasion. And I was struck by, first of all, what was going on, of course, but also the way in which we talked about it and the way in which we rhetorically framed it. I mean, the words we use. I'm calling it a Capitol assault, but the word that was used was mob frequently. Everyone knows what happened on the 6th, right? So there was this mob of people stormed the Capitol building and tried to disrupt the vote counting of the Electoral College, instigated by President Trump, calling for them to do this. So he had this rally and he said to them, he encouraged them to go. You can watch the video of it. And so they stormed the Capitol building. One of the protesters was fatally shot.
Yeah, that's right. They don't know.
One of the police defending was fatally injured as well. Injuries all going on. Okay, so that's the background. As I thought about the way that we're talking about it as a mob, I think this is the wrong term. What I want to talk about, the way I want to think about what happened on January 6th, is not a mob. A mob to me is what happens when pent-up frustration erupts. I don't think this was an eruption. I think this was instigated. And I think the instigation gets lost when we call it a mob. When I think mob, I think of hockey fans who, after their team wins or loses, they trash their town. That's not what happened. What happened was a powerful political figure instigated an act of violence, primarily through emotional, non-rational appeal, built over years and years, even decades, of the socialization of violence, that it's appropriate to be violent to people who are different from you. And it's embedded within years and years of built up political, religious, economic systems which enabled this. And there is, unfortunately, a pattern of this sort of thing, and that's a crusade. What we see here is a crusade. It's a call for a crusade. To be clear, I'm not a scholar of medieval era, so I'm using secondary sources here. I haven't looked at the original, French, German, Latin materials from the Crusades, but this looks really similar to me. It looks like you have a political figure who's having deep problems on the home front, who uses violence against the other as a way to try to prop up his own regime and to maintain a hold on power. And that's really what we see in the Crusades as well. And it's built on this idea that there's a perception that the in-group is threatened by the out-group. In the case of the Crusades, there truly was, with very limited exceptions, really no great danger that, in that case, the Muslim other was posing to Christian Europe. But there was a perception that Christian Europe was threatened in the same way in which the white Christian majority that Trump was very much speaking to they perceive that they are under assault, that they are losing their country, they have to make it great again. And that's sort of the tipping point. And then when you combine this with this, as I called it, socialization, that violence towards the other is acceptable, that the other has to be fought against, then that is what combines, it's instigated by a political figure. And then the violence goes out of control, because that's what we learn from the Crusades. The lesson of the Crusades was that the political Christian leaders in Europe thought they could direct all of their problems towards this Muslim other. In fact, what happened, as all of us, many of us know, studying Jewish history, the Crusades were equally violent towards Jews, towards other Christians, Eastern Orthodox Christians, anyone along the way. You can't control the violence, and that's what I saw in this January 6th event. It looked like a mini crusade to me. When we think about it that way, it makes me think about how can we prevent it? Because here I want to take more of a normative approach than an historical one. The Crusades were horrible, and I think what happened January 6th is horrible. And I think we have to ask, how can we prevent these sort of actions from ever happening again? There's where I wonder if we think about the model of the Crusade might be helpful. The Crusades really only ended when Europe transitioned, when it moved from a medieval era to the pre-modern era with the Enlightenment. I'm not sure you can envision quite the same thing happening today, but is there something analogous to an Enlightenment that can occur, particularly among conservatives and among the right, which can lead the people who were involved or were supportive, even tacitly, what was going on January 6th, to walk away from it? I'm not sure. And I should say I'm not a conservative, so I'm not part of this movement. I'm not part of those conversations. But what has to happen? Is there a Mitt Romney type figure who can collectively lead America's right towards a more Enlightenment perspective, which rejects violence towards the other and rejects sort of this sense of overarching persecution, in the sense that their world is being assaulted, and the only way to defend it is to take up arms against the other. I don't know if I'm a horrible projector as an historian, but I would imagine one way forward would be people like Romney, or maybe even McConnell. McConnell seems like was utterly frightened by what happened on the 6th, to chart some sort of way forward, intentionally switching directions. But I don't know if that is feasible. Again, I'm not a political scientist, so I'm not sure if even that is possible, given the way that the Republican National Committee is structured, which is primarily filled with Trump loyalists. And ultimately, most politicians are in it for themselves. So I'm not even sure if there's much interest among them. As long as they're going to get reelected, I'm not sure they're really thinking about their movement. So those are some of the thoughts that occurred to me as I was thinking about what happened January 6th. To switch gears a bit, so I had thought about all of that before the inauguration as I was jotting down ideas of what can we talk about. So I want to hear what you all think about this, because again, I'm not a historian of the Crusades, but I do think that if we think about it as a crusade, it helps us model how we can try to move past this. The other thing I want to talk about is,
we do have a quick question, which is a little bit on this. Do you see any correlations between QAnon and the religious cults of the past?
Yeah, so I want to talk about QAnon too. Yes. So it's interesting. I just spent this last week, I was reading 3 or 4 articles on QAnon. I'm teaching, I start teaching next week, and I'm going to assign it to my students to look at. Yeah, I mean, so QAnon, for those who aren't familiar, although probably everyone's heard the term, is one of the movements, the social movements, which help sort of instigate this violence as well. They have been, and they're all over. So when I went to a counter protest here in Highland Park, we had there was a Trump protest in Highland Park here, and I went to a counter protest with, there was a QAnon person there, so anyone went to that protest as well. I think they were in Deerfield too, the QAnon people, the big Q sign. It's based on this idea that there is a conspiracy, a deep state that Trump would instigate what was called the storm, and during the storm, the deep state would be revealed. All of the criminals and pedophiles and monsters, figurative and literal, inside the government would be expunged. They would be collectively executed, and that basically all of from their perspective, everything wrong in the world would be righted by this great upheaval that Trump would instigate. Does it look like other new religions? Absolutely. It looks like classical millennialism. So classical millennialism is this sort of this end of the world motif. It's always the end of the world as we know it and the creation of a new world. Almost no one wishes for like complete destruction. It's rather a destruction of what we see around us. And we can see this in everything from within the Jewish tradition, sabbatai tzvi in the Middle Ages, late Middle Ages, early modern, and the idea that there'd be a sort of this new messianic world. Going even earlier, you can look at all of the Christian Jewish messianic movements, and then in terms of more recent new religious movements, certainly everything from the Moonies to even the Scientologists call for sort of these this new world dawning. The New Age movement is part of this too, and QAnon actually has deep roots in the New Age movement. The idea that the old world has to be swept away and a new one is coming in. It's just that theirs is particularly oriented around conspiracies and around support for Trump. So, yeah, there's a lot with QAnon. I think that's part of what fed into it. Thank you for the question. Are there other questions, Vanessa, that I'm missing? I haven't been looking at the chat.
Yeah, there's one, and how do you talk about these issues with your students, and what are their reactions? And of course, you'll know more next week.
Well, I mean, I could talk about it in the fall. So one thing I do when I talk with my students is, first of all, when I teach, I'm aware that there are students in my classroom who vote or choose not to vote for different political parties. And I try to make all of my students feel welcome in the classroom and they can have an open discussion. I do draw lines, and the lines are around things like ad hominem attacks and explicit racist statements and sexist statements and anti-Semitic, anti-Islamic statements. So how do I teach it? It's a very careful dance. Because in the classes I teach, about 85% of my students think that Trump is a monster and the Republican Party is a beacon of evil, and 10 to 15% think that Biden is a socialist and that Trump is the only thing standing between us and Armageddon. So how I teach it is actually it's a very careful dance. I try to root it in primary sources. Let's look at the actual sources. So if we want to talk about Trump, let's look at something Trump actually said. If we want to talk about Biden, look at what Biden actually said. If we want to talk about QAnon, look at what QAnon actually says. I'm not making up that QAnon thinks that there's a secret cabal of pedophiles who are drinking human blood inside the Capitol building. They actually say it, and here is a document where they actually say it. So again, that's the answer. So we go to the sources, let the sources speak for themselves. It's tough to teach though. I taught last semester an American religious history course. So we framed a lot in terms of what had happened before. So when we were talking about politics, we were talking about the Know Nothing Party, and we talked about 19th century anti-Catholicism, nativism, anti-Semitism. And there's no denying we can look at the historical evidence of the power of all those, and my students could make the very clear inference about what was the connection between what we're looking at in the 19th century and the 21st century. So this semester I'm teaching on new religious movements, so it'll be somewhat similar. I want to talk briefly about the inauguration itself, because a couple of things really jumped out at me, and also I think that the great feeling. I was listening to NPR yesterday, and I was listening to On the Media, and one of the things that one of the journalists was saying was that the great failure they had made over the last 4 years was letting Trump set the agenda for them. That then they walked into the newsroom every morning. It was, what did Trump tweet? What do we report on? And I think that I've I've fallen guilty to that too, both today and in my teaching, is what is Trump doing? I have to respond to it. So I think to try to close that book and move into the next 4 years, to think about what President Biden did and said at his inauguration and the tone that's going to set. And again, I was tuned in to look for religion. Now, I should say it was the inauguration itself and sort of that immediate part that I'm commenting on and I'm looking at. Because I have kids, I didn't watch the whole day's worth of coverage. So I know there was a bunch going on afterwards, but I'm thinking about the actual ceremony itself and what started before it. So of course, the sort of the beginning of the inauguration begins with worship. And that's been the case for many presidents. So there's nothing new that Biden began his day with Christian worship. It's also not surprising that in particular it was Catholic, because he is Catholic. He's the second Catholic president. There's no denying and there's no hiding from the Catholicism of Biden and the way in which he infuses that into his public life. And I think that's really remarkable and interesting. And I have a hunch that part of what Biden is doing is very intentional here. I do think he speaks from the heart and that he truly is a devoted Catholic and that Catholicism is central to his life. I also think in a very smart way, he is trying to present another model for public religiosity and civic religiosity and the relationship of politics to religion based on Catholic social teachings, which are very different from the primarily evangelical Protestant model that, Trump is not an evangelical, but he's paying lip service to it and identifying himself as part of that track. George W. Bush is probably a better example of someone who really is part of that world and was representing evangelical Protestantism. Jimmy Carter, of course, as well. Of course, he was more of a progressive evangelical. But I think that President Biden really is trying to present this other model of how to be a Christian and how to think about politics and connect them, coming out of his Catholic social tradition. So it began with church worship, which again is not particularly surprising. His was clearly coming out of the Catholic tradition, given his identity. But when it comes to the actual inauguration itself, I was struck by two things. One is the continued presence of civil religion. So civil religion, if you haven't heard that term before, is the idea that there is a current within American political life of a religious tradition outside of any particular religion, which makes theological claims and has particular doctrines and rituals associated with it that hold up America as having a special relationship with God. This draws from the Jewish and Christian traditions, but it's not part of the Jewish and Christian traditions. So when a president or a political figure says, God bless America and God bless our troops, this is a religious claim. It is a claim that our troops are to be blessed by God, and it's petitionary prayer, which has all sorts of assumptions that if you say it, God is listening, God will act. So this is real religion, it's real theology. When you make a prayer like that, when you say something like that, when you say God bless our troops, that's real religion, but it is not identical with Christianity or Judaism, even though it's often drawing from Christian and Jewish contexts and in particular texts and traditions, but it's meant to stand outside. I think President Obama was often very explicit about the way in which he tried to frame his civil religious discourse as very inclusive. And you can actually go back, of course, to probably President Eisenhower is the most maybe explicit about this, what he said famously, and I think many of you have probably heard of this, this claim that America is built on the strong religious, strong religious identities, and I don't care what it is. The idea that to be American is to be religious, but you can be any sort of religion. So that the civil religion comes out. If you were to go to Washington, D.C., as I think many of us probably have, walk into the Lincoln Memorial and you'll see there's a little sign that says, "This place, you are on sacred ground. This is a shrine. Please keep your voice down. Don't smoke." Things like that. It's the same sort of thing you'd have in a church. And when you walk into there, you treat it like you would treat a church or a synagogue or a mosque or a temple. So civil religion is a real sort of religious thing. It has prayers, it has rituals. The idea of under God stamped onto our coins and part of our pledge. So do we see that in Biden's inauguration? Absolutely. We certainly saw these sort of appeals to this. It's not bland, it's just sort of a general religiosity. God bless America, God bless our troops. It's unremarkable. If a president didn't do this, it would jump out. So there's nothing really surprising here. I wasn't expecting not to see it. Frankly, I think what he did in terms of sort of that civil religious sort of invocations look pretty much the same as what we see elsewhere. Again, Trump is sort of the oddball, because while he did that, he usually sort of conflated it with sort of this evangelical Protestant idea. And I think it's because he basically was just appealing to that base and didn't know any better. Whereas I think when we see with President Biden, it looks a lot more like Presidents Obama, George W. Bush, and then really the last 4 or 5 presidents who are really trying to sort of have a broad religious connection that way. But alongside, at the same time, we have all of these very explicit Christian and in particular Catholic moments as part of the inauguration. So the invocation by the Jesuit priest, and I'm blanking on his name. I have my notes, but they're not. I scrolled away from them. I used the president of Georgetown, Father. Someone can correct me. This was the one when I was sitting there watching, and when he name dropped the Pope, it's when it should become clear that there's a very particular Catholicism to this. When he referenced Pope Francis and Pope Francis's call. Now, of course, when he referenced Pope Francis during this opening invocation, this opening prayer, it was not Pope Francis saying anything very Catholic sounding. It was Pope Francis talking about care for each other and for the environment and for people. So it was sort of a general message, but nevertheless, it was rooted in Catholicism.
Reverend James Martin.
Thank you, James Martin. Thank you.
I Googled it. I had no idea.
I had it in my notes. I don't know why it's missing right now. I think I scrolled around in my notes. You see me over here. It's like in my notes. But there were Catholic prayers throughout that. Now, Reverend Martin did cite a couple of scriptures. One was New Testament explicitly. I think it was James, I'm trying to recall, but also referenced what Christians would call the Old Testament, we call the Tanakh. So there was a Tanakh reference as well. So again, you could read this either as sort of internally Catholic, because of course the Tanakh is part of their Old Testament as well, or you could look at it as sort of a broad attempt to sort of reach out to sort of a broader Jewish Christian audience as well.
He referenced Psalms, Tehillim.
Psalms, yeah, exactly. Well, and Biden did too. Biden did Psalms.
Right, Biden did. And the only reason I know that is, some rabbi I follow on Twitter tweeted that out. Mm-hmm. I have 2. George Washington added "So help me God" to the oath.
Yeah.
And Carol says, I was struck by none of the clergy saying Jesus Christ. So that sounds like civil religion to me.
Yeah. And I don't know if President Biden asked or if this was simply they knew well enough that at a public event like this, which is meant to be broad, to avoid the invocation. It jumped out at me too when particularly when Reverend Martin gave the invocation, and also, and again, I lost all my names, but the African Methodist Episcopal gentleman who also gave the prayer, he also avoided the typical Christian ending to a prayer is to pray in Jesus' name. So that would be the typical ending. It's not there. You don't, within the Christian theological tradition, it's not as if that's required. So it wasn't as if, a person got up to say the Shema and just like skip the second stanza or something. So it's not like it's not a requirement. But the fact that they did avoid explicit mentions of the Trinity of Christ did jump out at me as well. Again, it's not surprising. It's something that by and large we expect on the presidential stage. Instead, what we get was the St. Augustine reference, which that was really fascinating. So when President Biden referenced St. Augustine, he did 2 things. The first thing he did is, he didn't disguise that he was referencing St. Augustine. He could have said a great religious thinker. And instead, he picks St. Augustine. So he does say it's St. Augustine. He cites properly. He also called him a saint within my church, which is a really fascinating way to refer to Augustine, who's not just a saint. He's one of the doctors of the church. He's basically the most important theological thinker within Catholicism. When it comes to, in the broader Christian tradition, when it comes to ideas like original sin or sort of the nature of Christ's, the reason for Christ's sacrifice and death and resurrection and all that stuff, that's Augustinian thinking. That it comes out of St. Augustine. He's the guy, with Paul too, but it was Augustine who sort of took the entire thing and made a theological system out of it. So he is the Christian thinker. And to have Augustine name dropped and as part of President Biden's speech was, I think, important. What's interesting though is, again, he was was identified as a saint within my church. And the actual content of what Augustine wrote, which was being cited by Biden, was really about the place of love and community and the way in which people had to support each other. And it's sort of the idea of the beloved community, and it's part of Augustine's City of God model, the idea of sort of we're all in this together. It was a call for unity, and it was probably the most simultaneously Christian part of the inaugural address, and also the most general part as well, because it was this sort of theological claim that pretty much every religious person could agree with, the idea of people supporting each other, we're all in this together, that to love God requires loving one's fellow human being. And I mean, this is part of it's part, he didn't give the entire sort of section from City of God, but it was the idea that there's nothing sort of particularly theologically Christian about it. It's something which pretty much every religious person could agree with, the idea that humans are embedded in relationships with each other, and that is central. But it is the first time, as far as I'm aware, that any president in an inaugural address has ever referenced particularly Saint Augustine. So that definitely jumped out at me.
So it was Reverend Sylvester Beeman for the benediction.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
And Rabbi Ike checking in, the absence of "in Jesus' name" is common among interfaith gatherings except for evangelicals. So the absence of evangelicals means that no one had to instruct clergy to speak in God's name rather than bring Jesus into it.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I would be surprised if it even would have occurred to the Christian ministers who were present that anyone had to ask them not to. And we should have, there are some evangelicals too who would try to play nice in a broader interfaith way. But I think those tend to be more the progressive evangelical side. Again, think like the Jimmy Carter sojourners, that side of evangelicalism. But I thank you for that. You're right. Yeah. The other part that jumped out at me in terms of religiosity was the use of Amazing Grace. And this struck me for several reasons. One is I think it was very explicitly connecting back to the legacy of President Obama, who's well known for his singing of American Grace at the memorial. And in fact, even I forget whoever came to speak right after the hymn, but actually referenced that as well. Said, "Oh, President Obama did that too." So I think that when they were designing the program, certainly the people who said, "Well, let's do let's do Amazing Grace," we're thinking of sort of the way in which this replicates and sort of resummons this sort of the legacy of President Obama, and the idea of sort of an American Christian religiosity which is broad and inclusive and progressive in sentiment. Roy Blunt, thank you. Yes.
Yeah. So right, Ross said it was Senator Roy Blount, Republican of Missouri, and it was Garth Brooks who sang.
Yeah.
Don't you think? I thought that there was meaning in their madness with, they picked somebody who's a Republican.
Yeah. Well, and I think also what really struck me. So that was the first thing I wanted to say was I think it was again sort of an appeal to sort of the legacy of President Obama. But the other thing is when Garth Brooks got to, I think it was the third verse, and he said, wherever you are, I want you to take part. That struck me as a very interesting move, because it is ultimately a Christian hymn. So the invitation for all of us, every American, to take part in the singing of a Christian hymn is both simultaneously an invitation in to be part of this sort of this event and part of the inauguration itself. And so for those who may be reticent to do so, particularly those on the right, to hear Garth Brooks, who, Vanessa, as you pointed out, is one of them. Here's this guy in cowboy boots and jeans, right, up on the stage, and we should also not wearing his mask afterwards, right? So here's a guy who looks like you and speaks to you and has been a country music star, part of one of your people saying, "Sing with me." So yeah, I'm inviting you in, the way in which that's meant to draw you in. But at the same time also, I couldn't help but wondering, does it repel those who find Amazing Grace to be particularly Christian? This is a Christian hymn. Now, it's a Christian hymn whose theology is under the surface. I mean, it's not all about, Jesus saves, come to Jesus right now, but it actually is all about that. It just doesn't use those words. The theology is clearly in there. The amazing grace is the grace of Christ. It's about salvation. It is theologically Christian. It just isn't. It doesn't say it in words which would be offensive to a non-Christian who's actually singing it. So as he said that, I was trying to think, well, it's both inclusive, but it's also not. But I suspect also that you and I may not have been the intended audience to listen to him saying, "Stand up and sing with me." So again, the way this was choreographed, as a performance, what was the role it served? But that really struck me.
Rabbi said, though most Jews probably don't know, James is the most Jewish book in the Christian Bible. James emphasized Acts meets vote as more important than faith. He also comments that its history as an anti-slavery hymn is also interesting.
Absolutely, yeah, I would agree. And I don't know, certainly when President Obama sang it at Bethel, that it was, his audience, African-American audience, would be well aware of that. Yeah, I would assume your average American Christian listener would be aware of the anti-slavery side of it as well, but it's, I don't know, it struck me as there was some sort of homey and sort of down home about Garth Brooks's singing of it as well. It didn't strike me particularly as churchy either. It struck me as sort of, I don't know. There's a distinction between what's called low church and high church often. So high church is sort of the hymns that are sung with an organ, with the choir and everything, and low church is sort of is song. It was just sung in a certain way.
Right. Rabbi also said we've been singing the first verse of Amazing Grace in a mashup with Hine Matov at our MLK services over the last couple of years.
I remember that. It's actually, it's beautiful. It's really beautiful. It's a beautiful song. And again, it's an interesting choice in hymns because although the theology is implicit in it, it's not explicit. That one can think of grace in a very broad sense. And I think I have to say, I remember learning this song, I think in piano lessons when I was like 8 or 9. I don't think I ever realized it was a Christian hymn. I think I associated, if anything, with funerals. And I had no idea there was a theological content at all behind it. Really, I don't think until I was a religion major in college and started looking at hymns as theological statements. Hymns are great that way. The way in which as you're singing them, you often don't pay attention to the lyrics. You're paying attention to so much more, and they can work on multiple levels. But yeah, Amazing Grace definitely jumped out at me. I see another comment popping up.
Well, Holly said, is Amazing Grace becoming more Americanized and universal, like Valentine's Day, Halloween, and I would also throw in Christmas. And I wonder how, our younger year students, think about Amazing Grace and because of its popularity. Pamela said Amazing Grace was a song by Janis Joplin, and she made it popular among the hippies.
So the question was, what do my students think about it?
Well, has it become more Americanized? Like,
sure.
Is it, as you said before, it's more like low church, meaning, it's for Americana and for everybody out there and its accessibility. But, is it more American? Is it more religious?
I suppose yes. I think it's embedded within particular sort of cultural moments too. But yeah, I hadn't realized. You said Janis Joplin had popularized it as well. I'm not aware of that particular history of it within the countercultural movement. Certainly, my students who are millennials and afterwards wouldn't be aware of that. I think for many of them, so if we're looking sort of forward, again, the religiosity of it is probably absent. It's simply a song. And maybe, I'm guessing here, but this is based on a hymn which I do teach with my students we look at, which is Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory. So that's one I actually do teach, and that was not sung at the inaugural. So we're on a tangent here, but that's one which by Harriet, not Harriet, Walker Stowe. Blanking on her first name, maybe it's Harriet Walker Stowe, and she wrote this during the Civil War, and it is explicitly religious if you actually read the lyrics. But the way it gets used in popular culture and just sort of is present, sort of the religiosity of Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory gets sort of dropped. Although even if you listen to the title, it's there. So what I ask my students when I teach this, we spend a whole day looking at this hymn and other hymns from the Civil War era. When I ask students when we first start, do you know Julia? Was it Juliet? It went too fast.
It's Julia Wardhouse.
Wardhouse. Yes, yeah. Julia Wardhouse. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Harriet Beecher. That's where the Harriet came from. Yeah, it's Julia Wardhouse. Yeah. So when I show this to my students, that when we start that class, almost none of them associate it with religion, even though it's clearly a hymn. The Battle Hymn of the Republic, so that based on that experience, I would guess that Amazing Grace, perhaps yes, Battle Hymn of the Republic. That Amazing Grace is probably in the same category. They're aware of it as a song, and its religious references are sort of over their heads. That's my guess. How did we get on that topic? Oh, okay, with Amazing Grace. The last thing I wanted to mention in terms of the inauguration itself, is in the chat here. Is that amazing poem by Amanda Gorman, which also had a biblical reference. It was Micah, if I recall. And it was done in such a way that I couldn't tell if this was a civil religious sort of broad sort of non-explicit sort of reference to the sort of biblical grounding of American culture, or if she was sort of inserting her poem within a particular Jewish Christian trajectory. And I'm not entirely certain, and that's because I don't know enough about her as a poet and where she's going with her work. There are certain poets where they certainly they will pull references from here and there, and they're just references. There are others where they're pulling from is entirely important. And I just don't know enough, except it did jump out at me that she was quoting, I'm certain it was Micah. She was so when you get sort of these religious references dropped in, is it just because that's part of sort of the shared biblical heritage of America, sort of this vague civil religiosity, or was this a particular sort of setting up the trajectory of her poem and her work in a particular direction? I just don't know.
Yeah, I mean, she's not even a millennial. She's what the next Gen
whatever
Z.
they call the next one. Yeah,
Right.
I don't even know what we call the next generation after them.
I'll look that up in a second. Jim Schuster said, religion in general has definite resonance with conservatism in general, as well as the far right. One commentator I heard felt Biden's use of religion was one of the few ways he could reach out to them and try to at least throw a sort of olive branch or message of unification.
I think that makes sense. I also really think that he's trying to challenge the idea of religion equals conservative equals Protestant equals evangelical, which has very much been, if you listen to President Trump talking about religion, religion always equaled Christianity and pretty much equaled Protestantism and pretty much equaled conservative evangelical Protestantism. When he talked about our faith, our religion, that's what he was talking about. Now, he of course had no idea, holds the Bible upside down, et cetera, but that's what he knew what he thought would get him reelected. I think President Biden is in a very explicit way trying to challenge that and saying, I can be equally religious, equally Christian, but in a way which is very, very different. There is a lot present within the Catholic tradition he can draw on out of the Catholic social traditions. And I would not be surprised to see him doing so over the next 4 years, to see him pull from the Catholic worker tradition, from other sort of very left-leaning forms of Catholicism. Certainly Pope Francis himself provides plenty of material for this. Now, that's not to say there aren't right-leaning Catholics. There's plenty of those too. But I think that Biden is very explicitly trying to present another model of how to be Christian in public life in a way which which isn't just sort of throwing an olive branch, although I agree he's doing that too. He's a politician. He's clearly doing that. But he's also trying to offer another way where you can be truly Christian in a way which equates and inserts you within a more liberal religiosity. We already have that for Black Protestants. I mean, so that's clear. I mean, no one's going to doubt that. I mean, we have Martin Luther King himself as sort of the emblem of this. But the idea of sort of Black Christians as having sort of a place within the liberal, progressive political world is unquestioned. I think he's trying to offer for white Christians another model. And again, that's been present within Catholicism for a very long time. It's been present within Protestantism too for a very long time. And Jimmy Carter, right? I mean, you can't miss it. It's just that if you listen to Republicans talk over the last 40 years, Christian has equaled evangelicalism with maybe some conservative Catholics thrown in there too. And I think that's what he's trying to challenge. And again, my guess is over the next 4 years, we'll see attempts to sort of broaden that appeal as well.
I can't help myself for bringing this up, but Roe versus Wade's 48 years. How do you think, and not that he's the president and he's not going to bring it up, but how do you think his Catholic, background is going to affect that? Should that become a discussion? How is that going to affect it?
So a majority of American European descended Catholics support Roe v. Wade. Not a majority if you include the Hispanic, Latinx Catholics, but among people like Biden, so the descendants of European Catholics, his stance on Roe v. Wade is common. To say, well, and more broadly, his stance on Catholic family teachings, so birth control, things like that. He's like most American Catholics. He's that, yeah, sure, the church says this, and I recognize the church saying no birth control, no abortion, but in actuality, either they're wrong or maybe they're right, but we can't impose that on everyone else. It gets much more nuanced. I don't know how he's going to do that dance as the president. As a private citizen, as a Catholic, there's plenty of Catholics who do that and maintain their good standing within the Catholic Church, but they don't have to meet with the Pope. So I don't know how he, as a public figure, is going to navigate that. Except for that, those are tense waters, and there's conflict even among the Catholic hierarchy about that. So the statements so the Catholic bishops met right after the inauguration. It was 2 days after. And I very quickly skimmed a news report when they after their meeting, and they had a very their statement about the inauguration and President Biden, who's one of them, was not nearly as positive as I thought it would be. It was much more sort of neutral. And I think this is their concern that although he is Catholic and identifies as Catholic, he's not Catholic in the way in which the more conservative bishops want him to be Catholic. So that's going to be a tension for him, and I don't know how he's going to handle that.
And would you lump gay marriage into that tension bag?
Yeah, I would as well, and numerically it lines up as well. So the polls show that American Catholics, white American Catholics are the overall support gay marriage as well. So against the teachings of their church.
Okay. I have another question. Do you reveal to your students either your political beliefs, that you're Jewish, and do you think, they care about that, or it's a major topic for them?
They always ask, and I always tell them that in the classroom, I am whatever religion I'm teaching at the moment. So if I'm teaching on Puritans, I'm speaking as a Puritan. I'm going to try to represent the ideas of the people I'm speaking of. This is actually, it's not tough with Puritans. It's tough when I'm teaching on slave-holding antebellum Christians who thought that slavery was a good thing. But even then, I'm going to try to speak for them and present why they thought that was a good thing. I always bracket at the beginning by saying slavery is wrong and horrible, and I personally don't support it, but I need to try to help us understand what these sources are saying and why people in the 1820s thought that this made sense. And at the end of the day, we can say, you know what, they were hypocrites and we hate them, but at least let's understand where they came from. And if students really want to know what religion I am, I say they can talk to me after class, and I'll tell them outside in the hallway. But in the classroom, I speak for whatever I'm teaching at the moment. My political views, I make it clear that there are certain things which I don't consider political but moral. My opposition to racism, to anti-Semitism, to Islamophobia, to homophobia, I don't consider these political. I consider these moral positions, and I'm clear about them. And my students who walk up to my office door see I have a sign for ally, and I have a whole bunch of stuff. So I mean, they know it when they walk in. I just don't see that as political. However, when I'm teaching, again, I try to make it not about my politics. Unless it's relevant, I don't bring it up. If a student asks, I don't hide it. I think I have to say where I am if it's relevant. But it usually doesn't actually come up that often.
Any other? Because my next question for you, you spoke to us last year about cults, and I appreciate what you said today, that Trump's supporters were like a crusade, and I kicked myself last year for not asking you if the Trump supporters was a cult. I was waiting for someone to bring it up, and I should have brought it up myself. But if they're a cult, if they're a crusade, how do we talk to these people? Because half of the people in America, and there could be somebody here this morning, thought that, how do we speak to them?
Yeah, well, I mean, so the reason I'm always wary of calling Trumpism a cult is that I don't think cult has any particular meaning. I think the way it's used is just sort of someone else's religion or that we don't like, or maybe not religion, whatever it is. Cult just means a bad social group we don't like. So I'm not sure it provides much utility. The way you get someone out of a cult is the way you get someone out of any social, religious, political organization, which is it varies, depends on the person in the group. There's no single way. And so that's why I'm really wary. So Steve Hassan, he just has a book out about, he's an anti-cultist. He's a professional anti-cultist. People hire him to get their kids out of cults. But the sort of cults you can get your kid out of can be everything from a fundamentalist church to a new age group, to a Hindu yoga teacher, to a political group. It's just something which you don't like. And the way he gets people out is various. So I'm not sure there's a lot of utility in calling Trumpism a cult, although certainly I personally don't like Trumpism, so I guess it would count in that way. The reason I use crusade as a metaphor is I think it offers a little more value. If we can think about why did the Crusades end, what can we do to make sure that they don't happen again? In the same way, in terms of cults, I mean, there's always going to be cults. There's always going to be religious, spiritual groups we don't like. They're never going to stop forming. But hopefully there's no more crusades. So that's why I was thinking about that as a model. In terms of the cult connection, though, I will say, and the caveat is, there's value to the idea of charisma and thinking about the charismatic leader and the power of the charismatic leader. Charisma is always in the eye of the beholder. What one person finds charismatic, another person finds repulsive or frightening. Charisma is best understood as a process, as an interplay between a leader who has certain abilities. Those abilities could include everything from stage magic to modulation of the voice to the way in which they're able to work a crowd. But it's an interplay of those natural abilities, or maybe not natural, sometimes learned abilities a speaker, a leader has, and the content, what they're actually saying, and the people who are listening. And charisma is built up over time by a leader who convinces people that usually he or she is offering something to them that they need, that they want, and that only he or she can provide to them. And it becomes a cycle that he or she needs them and they need him or her. Trump's first acceptance speech at the Republican nominating convention, from the first one, that's the one, is maybe the best example of that, where he said to the people attending, he said, "You need me. America is in flames. It's falling apart. It's at war. Only I can save you." I mean, that's maybe the most explicit sort of building up of the charisma, that you have a problem. Let me tell you what your problem is. here's a solution, only I offer it to you. You need me and I need you to vote for me. And that's charisma. We see it in the way that Reverend Moon talked to his people, the way in which Bhaktivedanta, founder of the Hare Krishnas, would talk to his folks as well. I mean, you can see it in Jim Jones. You can see it in all this, the way in which it builds up. If you want to make a political connection as well, I mean, obviously Hitler is the classic example. But I think that President Obama did the same thing too. President Obama's charisma, I think he used for much better purposes, but I think it was the same thing. He made you feel like you were part of a movement for hope and change, and that he needed you and you needed him, and he presented what the problem was, and he gave you a solution, and you became invested in it. I mean, that's charisma, but it is in the eyes of the beholder. President Trump was able to do that particularly well, and he did it in a 21st century mediated way using Twitter. And I think that was his brilliance, that he was able to do this in a way in which no one else had done before. I suspect that we're going to see people trying to imitate it. Ted Cruz is trying to imitate it now. We're going to see people trying to replicate the Trump's charisma to greater or lesser success.
I have two questions for you. Though you're not a political scientist, what needs to happen in America for a Jew to become president, or is this possible? And unrelated, what effect has the pandemic had on religion in America?
I remember when Lieberman ran for VP, he gave a very good speech about how, it was very similar to the Kennedy speech about how, he was Jewish, but that was okay. You can still vote for me. So Kennedy is, most famous for this. He goes before all the Baptists in Texas and says, I'm Catholic, you can still vote for me. It's okay. So I think we're past that. And of course, Romney gave that speech too. I'm Mormon, but it's okay. You can still vote for me. So I think we're past the need to give the speech. Notice Biden didn't have to do that. Biden never had to give a Kennedy speech. So Catholics, Jews, and Mormons were through the first gate. I don't know. I mean, so I was struck by the way in which as Bernie has been running multiple times, Bernie Sanders, his Jewish background has never been brought up as a problem. At least not in any mainstream account that I've seen. I'm certainly there's anti-Semites on the side who hate him for lots of reasons, and that's just one of him. I don't know what it would take for a Jew to be president. My sense is it's easier now post-Biden election, and it's easier now post Bernie's primary runs and post Romney's presidential run, that the tent is expanded. I suspect a Jew will be president long before a Muslim will be president. So they haven't even gotten through that first hurdle, right?
I was just going to say that. Yeah.
So Jews have been part of the American political landscape for a lot longer, so it's not surprising. But I mean, the way in which Muslim politicians still have to sort of repeatedly make those speeches about I'm Muslim, but I'm not a terrorist. I'm Muslim, but I'm not. But I'm an American. I'm Muslim, but I don't think Jews have to do that anymore. However, I note that I'm saying this. I live in Highland Park. I mean, I used to live in North Carolina, and I in rural North Carolina, where it was a very different situation. Could a Jew ever win in rural North Carolina? I think that I'm a little wary of this.
All right, so we have what effect has the pandemic had on religion in America? And could you reflect on how the need for a community, the need to belong somewhere, and the possibility of using social media to immediately belong to something is affecting what is happening? So you got religion and the pandemic and social media.
I'm struck by the way in which religion, it really has bifurcated. Where religions which identify and are identified by their adherents with politically liberal or progressive or mainline practice, by and large have tried to avoid face-to-face worship and have followed the health and medical guidance, whereas those that identify with or are identified by their adherents with political conservatism have followed the lead of President Trump in terms of rejecting public health measures. Now, it's not a perfect lineup, but if you look at religious practice, it's disturbing to what degree religiosity lines up with political identity. Now, that isn't to say that in every one of those churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, gurdwaras, is necessarily everyone lines up politically the same way, but I can't help but notice that the Jews who are ignoring public health guidelines, including here in suburban Chicago, are the on the ultra orthodox side, to be blunt. And was it in Niles? It wasn't Niles. Where was the big outbreak at the Orthodox?
I think it was West Rogers Park, and it's the more observant, and in New York, and forcing Cuomo and to make some statements he had to take back. But yeah,
no, there was an NPR interview with the Hasidic public health spokesman who I forget which Hasidic house it was, but it was an NPR interview where he said, I know National Public Radio, he said, we are going to keep worshiping together and having our, I forget what they call their collective, the dinners with and he said, this is important to us, and we don't care what the mayor, what de Blasio says. We don't care what Cuomo says. It's this way in which over the last year, you have this alignment of the idea of religious freedom means I don't have to wear a mask, I can do whatever I want with, and means and equate support for a whole bunch of unrelated concepts. And the way in which on the other side you have what I would call this idea of sort of personal responsibility, and that adjustments have to be made. That's the broad pattern I've seen. I was just asked by a colleague to write about what new religions, what cults have done in the era of the pandemic. I'm not sure they're any different. The new religions or the cults which are more progressive and align themselves and are seen by their adherents as aligned in a more progressive way tend to follow the public health recommendations, and those that go the other direction tend not to. I think that new religions look just like old religions in terms of the pandemic. I'm struck by, I have a very good friend who is in the UK, and his research is on the Jehovah's Witnesses. And he's noted the way in which Jehovah's Witnesses have been, for them, one of their religious obligations is to go door to door and knock and make converts. And for them, they've had real problems. So there's clearly some variance here. So if your religion requires you, to get into heaven, you have to go knock on doors and make converts, then that's going to be a different issue. But one could say the same thing. There's maybe Rabbi can mention. Can you have the idea of Jewish funerals, and can you say Shiva? Can you hold Shiva electronically? And is it the same thing? Do you lose something? Can you have a minyan over Zoom? I have no idea what is the halakhic, response to that. And I would assume it varies between the Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Reconstructionist positions. Whether they're
right. I can tell you, we've been doing Shiva minyans, saying Kaddish over Zoom for 11 months.
Yeah, it wouldn't.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I can say briefly about that. There certainly is, among modern Orthodox, they sort of found their ways around it, right? How can you say Kaddish without a minyan? Well, if you're teaching people how to Kaddish, you don't need a minyan to teach them.
Okay.
So they'll do it at an online Shiva as teaching for the people who are there, and that works.
I love that.
So that's how modern Orthodox folks have been able to deal with the whole thing in a socially responsible way. And ultra Orthodox, you're absolutely right. It's much more difficult for them because they won't make that leap, and so they're anyone who believes that everything that happens is the will of God, right? They're stepping away from their personal responsibility.
Thank you. And I was looking up, when the pandemic began, there was a discussion among Catholic priests about whether people Catholics should take communion with unconsecrated hosts at home, whether that would be sort of equivalent or not. So I'd imagine you're going to see some of the same breakdowns in other traditions too, about to what degree. So for a Catholic to take communion with an unconsecrated host, that is, the priest hasn't actually said the prayer over it, it's not really communion. It's sort of communion-like. So I think you'd see some of the same sort of discussions. Can it be sort of, this isn't really communion, but it's sort of communion, versus, do you really want to tell an elderly Catholic lady to come into a church and be exposed to a virus just so she can make sure that the priest really did bless that little wafer? I haven't kept up with it. I know this was a discussion early on in the Archdiocese of Chicago about what to do about this. I think actually they were sending them around at one point.
So wrapping up, going back to
belonging. Wasn't that the other
belonging? Because we want to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, people often ask me where are all the new religions today. So in the 60s we had, like the Scientologists and the Moonies and the Krishnas and Divine Light Mission and Transcendental Meditation and all these groups. How come we don't see all these new religions popping up as much anymore? And the first thing I say is, well, they probably are out there. They're just small. We don't notice them. But the other thing I usually say is I think people find this on the internet now. We find this in communities on the internet. And that the era of having to join a group has been replaced by the era of you find your group online. And I think that's how I start to think about belonging, is that people find meaning in online communities. And to circle back to the person who asked about QAnon, I think that's what we see. QAnon is a really good example of this. QAnon is ridiculous. It is patently ridiculous. It is clearly not plausible to make the claims that QAnon does about these cabals of pedophile government agents in the basements of pizza parlors who are drinking human blood. And I mean, the whole thing is, it's ridiculous. It comes out of like the worst, like anti-Semitic blood libel combined with sort of, 1970s conspiracy theories with like Roswell. I mean, it's a conglomeration of the most patently ridiculous stuff put together. But the people who find meaning in this, particularly online in these unmoderated chat boards, which are in the dark internet, the parts you can't find on Google, you have to know where to find it. They find real meaning there. I've been reading the interviews that the New York Times and others has done with Q believers after what happened afterwards. They were expecting the end of the world basically, and it didn't happen. And first of all, they're disappointed, of course, but I also hear this idea that they had wrapped their identities up in this. People who said, I drove across country, I spent my rent money on going to DC so I could take part in the storm. I burnt all my bridges with my ex-wife, and I can't see my kid anymore because I'm into this now. And it's people for whom this is the center of their identity in their community. Now, again, I think I'm really sad they found that in QAnon, but I understand people need community and people need identity, and that people want to form their identity within a community. That's what we have here in Macomb Slough Lakeside. This is a community, and for all of us who are spending our time and our energy and our purse as part of this, then we get meaning out of it. Whether you like or dislike evangelical Christianity, it does the same thing. And people find this online in all sorts of weird little places like QAnon. And I have a friend from college who's a yoga guru, and he has developed the same thing with his followers, where they have sort of this, it's like a paid YouTube thing where they're all sort of part of it, and they pre-pandemic they would all go on retreats together every 3 or 4 years, and it's a niche. But it's there, and it provides meaning to people. Belonging, yeah.
Well, you have given us so much to think about today, and we love having you. And if next week, if you could just, it's your colleague, Rebecca Graff, could you just give us 2 sentences of what to expect next week?
Great. So Rebecca, she's talking about her archaeological research, right? Yeah. So she's great. Rebecca is, hold on, turn off. Professor Graff is, she's an urban archaeologist. So most of our images of archaeologists are people who are digging up, ancient stuff. She digs up stuff which is 100 years old. She's done work in New Orleans, but she's also done work in the Chicago World's Fair, 1894. So she's going to talk about the Columbian Expedition. And in particular, she was digging up one of the dump sites. Archaeologists love dump sites because that's where all the stuff goes. So she's going through the garbage, and she's able to reconstruct what was going on there, everything from what people were eating to what they were building. We, of course, have the historical record, so that she would call herself an historical archaeologist because she has the historical record to work with, as opposed to a Bronze Age archaeologist. So she can look at, here's what people wrote in their diaries or their letters, or the newspapers said this. Here's what I actually dug up, and can we correlate them? Are they, so it's going to be great. So if you're into archaeology or Chicago history, or into sort of the way in which we can reconstruct the past. It's great. And she's
or what not to throw away in your garbage. I always think about If they looked at my garbage, what would they say? So we can't wait to hear from Rebecca next week.
She's very good. She and I co-taught a class together on sensing Chicago. We had a seminar on how to on eating, smelling, seeing, tasting, hearing Chicago. So it's we've taught together. So she's great.
Okay, great. You're getting a lot of kudos in the chat. Thank you, everybody. Classes are this week. Look at your Macomb at home. If you're not sure, just email me. The movie for Real Classics on Tuesday is Al Jolson's, the jazz singer, right, Rabbi? Yes. Good.
That's right.
The 1927 one. Okay, it's great seeing anyone. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Very much for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Bye-bye.